Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about communication, leadership, various different communication styles and presentation skills. So before I get into our very interesting guest today, I'd like to offer you an opportunity to see where your presentation skills are strong by checking out our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your skills are strong and where perhaps a bit of support could help you get the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is a friend of mine, Allison O'Brien, who, when I met her, I knew immediately I needed to get her on the podcast because I talk a lot about how do you present yourself. She talks about listening and why it's so important to listen. And so she works with echo listening. And that's a way to recognize the way you listen and the way others listen so that you can improve your communication. The official bio is that Allison O'Brien is a facilitator and master trainer with Echo Listening Intelligence, which is based in Boulder. She's based in Boulder, Colorado. And since 2014, she's been helping to build a worldwide network of listening experts. She certifies practitioners to deliver the echo listening profile in 10 countries and across 4 continents. With a broad scope of work, executive leadership coaching, leadership training for new emergency and mid-level managers, workplace conflict resolution, and corporate communication training focused on listening, Allison O'Brien uses 2 assessment tools, the Echo Listening Profile I mentioned before, and the Conflict Dynamics Profile. Both instruments provide the crucial insights needed for shifting the way people communicate so that you can really change the world one conversation at a time. It's the way people receive information, share information, and manage their emotions in challenging situations. Allison says, "My genuine interest in people and what makes us tick has paved the way for a career helping individuals and companies transform the way they do business through the standpoint of culture, communication, and most importantly, listening. For decades, I've been intrigued by human interaction and the question of what is it that creates connection and how or why do we withdraw and disengage from each other?" As Allison got deeper into her career and had many more interactions in business settings, the follow-up question became, how does the way we communicate impact how we work with others, how we lead, how we make difficult decisions collaboratively, and also how we show up for the people that we love? In asking these questions, Allison became very curious, and it became clear that her life purpose is to change the way people live, love, and do business for the better. She said, "I believe it's rare to work every day in a job that aligns 100% with one's core values, passion, and purpose. I'm incredibly fortunate and profoundly grateful to be able to say without hesitation, this is true for me. We had a great conversation. I know you'll enjoy it. On to the interview with Allison O'Brien. Allison O'Brien, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm excited to chat with you.
We've known each other for not all that long, but it was one of those instant, okay, we need to do some stuff together, because I spent a lot of time talking about how you talk and you talk about how you listen, which is always good for me. It's a good lesson for me to learn to listen better. Before I get into the professional work you do, though, let me ask, who would be your dream interview? If you were to interview someone who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
So I know I should probably say someone really famous and someone who's made a huge impact on the world that everyone knows, but that's not my answer. My dream interview would be Irene Seller, who is my maternal grandmother.
Your mother's mother. Okay.
My mother's mother. Yes, Irene, who my daughter's middle named after. But she was just this vibrant woman who had this poise and was very quiet until she wasn't. Mm-hmm. And she was the life of the party without being the loudest voice in the room, but she was the one that everyone wanted there. The reason that I say her is that I regret that when she passed away, I was in my early 20s, mm-hmm. and, still a little bit in that self-absorbed mode and that youthful mindset where you believe you have all the time in the world. And I didn't understand at the time the depth of her experience and what I wanted to know about it. I didn't understand that until I got a little bit older, what it meant in terms of familial history, just understanding her at a deeper level. So she and my grandfather fled the Nazis in Austria in November of 1939. And there is so much to unpack just in that alone, but spent several months in Panama waiting to get into this country, arrived not knowing she was pregnant and had a baby on Ellis Island 2 days after arriving. My grandfather was not with her at the time. In fact, he wasn't even able to get here for another 5 months. Didn't know that he had a daughter. So just when you think about that, how does a woman who doesn't speak the language find her way from New York to Boston, where she had a sister with an infant in tow, never having anyway. So that's really the gist of it. I would love to hear more about that. And how do you survive that, losing everything, starting over and making your way?
You could probably talk to a recent immigrant and hear the same story. Somebody who walked from Guatemala to the US or something like that. And I understand about having been too self-absorbed in your 20s, which is what you're supposed to be. I mean, that's age appropriate. But I was 24 when my grandmother died. And I so wish I could go back and ask her the questions I understand as an adult. That I was 24. I was full of my exciting new life out of college. And so I love that. That's wonderful. Just out of curiosity, you talk a lot about listening, and it's sort of considered a soft skill, quote unquote, but that it's really something important. I'm curious if you learned any of that from your grandmother.
I've never been asked a question, anything like that, Elizabeth, and it's great. Did I learn any of that through my grandmother? I don't know that I could say yes to that. When I think back on observing my grandmother in conversation, she was muted, not submissive. That's not what I mean. But she took everything in. And then when she responded, it was either something really funny, a one-liner, something very appropriate to the question that was posed. She was not a rambler by any means. And so she commanded people's attention really because when she spoke, it was very deliberate. It was a chosen moment for her. It wasn't just impulsive. There was nothing impulsive about that woman. So she really gained respect and admiration from people, and they paid attention. So I think, now that you've asked me that question, and now that I'm thinking about it, it makes perfect sense, really, when you think about what people pay attention to in a speaker. Right? When it's concise, when it's to the point, when it's engaging, when it's appropriately delivered. So, yeah, I think it's a great question.
I think she listened, thought about what she was going to say, and said it to the point.
Yes.
Yes. As opposed to doing lots and lots and lots and lots of words and rambling. So that certainly is a lesson any speaker could learn.
Well, it's so interesting. She didn't seek attention, but she gained a lot of attention with people's intent to pay attention to her. So interesting. Yeah.
I think that's a lesson we could all learn. Why did you get into listening as a central focus for what you do?
It's a great question.
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter? So I'll just kind of go back to what you mentioned about listening being a soft skill, or in my opinion, listening not being a soft skill. So we hear this over and over again that there's training for soft skills, and communication and listening generally fits into that. And I disagree. I see listening as a hard power skill, meaning it's a driver of business profit. It is a driver of work outcomes, positive work outcomes. But there are a lot of myths around it. Myths that either people are a good listener or a bad listener, or someone is listening or they're not listening. And so these myths determine this preconception around listening being something that's fluffy, that takes the back seat to technical training or sales training or other kinds of technical development inside of an organization. And I say it's a skill or a hard skill that drives profit because miscommunication and misunderstanding in the workplace causes so much rework, loss of profit, churn, turnover. So we have so many metrics that we can attribute to the cost of poor listening for an organization. There's one figure that attributes for Fortune 500 companies, the annual losses are $32 billion for poor listening and poor communication.
Wow.
That's astounding. But, not all of us are in Fortune 500 companies. So that same metric, when you're looking at a company of 1,000 employees, is $62 million a year.
Well, it's one of those things, people come to me. I work with people who don't feel heard.
Yes.
And if you could train everybody around you to be heard, to listen, so that those who don't feel heard don't just quit and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's, and also many of us, and I know this from painful personal experience, is many of us feel that we aren't heard, but we aren't listening either.
So, I wanted to address that a little bit, just this piece of science around, why it is that we don't feel heard, why it is that people feel, that we're not speaking into something that they're really interested in listening to or for or engaging us. So often we put the onus on someone else to engage us. And really, it's on us that we have to take personal responsibility for engaging in what is being said or spoken. But The science shows us that listening is actually a brain-based activity, and that we over time develop habitual behaviors or preferences in what we listen to and for, what's easiest for us to pay attention to, what's most engaging to us, what we might unintentionally filter out. So we develop over time these habitual preferences. And once we become aware of them, we can start to shift in conversation, depending on who we're in conversation with, the context, the intended outcome, and really have more valuable conversations. So back to this idea of myth, we often think that either people aren't paying attention, we're not being heard, when really people are listening to something maybe that, or listening for something that we're not speaking about, or in a way that makes it easy for them to engage.
I think at this point I should have ask you explain what the echo listening system is.
Okay.
And what does ECHO stand for?
So ECHO is an acronym for Effective Communication for Healthy Organizations. And that's really what we're out to achieve, is to get people to develop what we call this skill of listening intelligence. So listening intelligence is an agility in our listening that we can develop over time once we become really aware of our habitual filters. And then we can apply a shift or a change in the moment, depending, again, on the context, the people involved, the intended outcome. So we can apply our listening intelligence to have the most beneficial outcome for everyone involved. So here's an example. Have you ever been in a meeting, or you talk to your clients who are in meetings? They leave the meeting feeling like everyone's aligned and on the same page. And then it becomes very clear, based on miscommunications, work outcomes that weren't meeting performance standards, et cetera, becomes very clear that people weren't actually on the same page, and people took away very different things from the exact same meeting. That's really what this is about, is that the science of the brain, the unique brain that we all listen to and for different things, we might feel that we're on the same page, and we're really actually walking away with very, very different takeaways from the exact same interaction.
Oh, yeah.
So echo listening model uses a scientifically validated assessment tool that identifies our habitual listening preferences. So I want to kind of make a distinction here that we hear with our ears, but we listen and make sense of what we hear with our brain.
Oh, I love that. Say that again, please.
So we hear with our ears, but we actually listen with our brain.
Okay. What are the 4 quadrants of the echo system? And then we'll put links in the show notes, but just to give us a basic overview.
So very high level, connective listening is an external filter. So this is someone who is listening and taking in information and applying it to the experience of others or the impact on others. So they're taking in, and then they're thinking about, well, what does this mean for my team, for my clients, for my vendors, for the outcome on people? So this is a listener who tends to favor feelings over facts and is really in tune to tone of voice, feeling in the room, harmony, alignment, and so may become almost the caretaker of a conversation when there are other people involved. Tend to overlook what the information means for them personally and how it impacts them. So they often have a lot of experience to bring to a situation or to the table, and it gets overlooked in favor of caretaking the group or caretaking others.
Which of the 4 quadrants is that?
That's called connective listening.
Okay.
And so we can compare that or contrast that with reflective listening, which is another habit. So if a listener has reflective listening as their dominant preference, they tend to filter information through the lens of what it means to them personally, how they can use that information to get their job done, how interested they are in that information, how they can personally apply it, or what they know about it already or have seen in their past experience. I want to make very clear this is not a listener who is a selfish person. Echo does not identify personality traits. It is not about hardwired characteristics. It's really about habitual preferences or the cognitive process in listening. So someone who's highly reflective, they have a very deep database of experience that they're consistently comparing what they hear to what they already know or what they're interested in. And then they'll speak from their own experience when they do articulate their opinion in a group setting. They may be hesitant to do that initially. These are folks who in a meeting might appear to be almost disengaged. And then later they'll come and they'll share their perspective. And it's often really, really well thought out because it's grounded in their experience.
I was just going to say, so this means would it be fair to say, if I'm understanding you, that you're taking in the information, a reflective listener takes in the information and processes it through what they know.
Yes.
So they have to relate it to something that they already know. And if they don't know at all, actually, I think this is where metaphors are really useful, because you want to choose a metaphor that people can relate to. And that's probably really good for reflective listeners.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing. It's not necessarily entirely what they already know. It's also what they're interested in. So, for example,
yes.
A highly reflective listener on a team that doesn't have any interest in doesn't have any experience with something, but has interest in it, that may be your magic bullet on the team if you need to do the research and have someone become a subject matter expert. Because if they're interested, they're going to leave that meeting and they're going to start Googling. They're going to sign up for a course. They are going to become the one that really knows and adds tremendous value to the team in that way. So it's not entirely just past experience. It's also what it means for them and the value that they see in it and the value that they can personally contribute. Right. This might be a good place to talk about. I'm going to talk about the other two habits, but just briefly, I'd love to just chat about the assumptions that we often make on different types of listeners based on what we observe in their body language.
Okay.
So we often make a lot of assumptions about other people and their level of interest or their level of engagement or whether they're interested and listening based on what we see in how they show up in their bodies. So connective listeners, for example, they tend to appear very engaged and supportive and in it with the speaker. So a connective listener will often lean in, make a lot of eye contact, nod, verbal encouragement. And so they really do appear to be actively engaged in listening. And that may not be the case. Because they are the caretaker, they often show up very encouraging in their body language, but they may be doing something else entirely in their head. I don't know if this has happened to you, Elizabeth, but I, at times, have appeared really engaged and I'm doing my grocery list. Or thinking about, right, what time do I have to pick up my kids from school?
I'm actually the other way around, is that people have come up, I have learned to adjust my body language because when I'm thinking, my face gets very grim. I watched my mother do this and I have same face. I fall into the same thing. And then people come up to me and they say, "Are you mad at me?" And I go, "No, why?" It's just, I was just thinking.
So that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, of the perceptions that we and the assumptions that we make about people when we observe their body language, and whether or not they have certain feelings about what we're saying, if it makes sense to them, if they agree, if they disagree. A reflective listener, going back to this habit, they are often really misunderstood by the rest of the team because when they're really taking in information and, going through their database, they often look really checked out or disinterested, disengaged. They tend to gaze at the horizon while they're listening or beyond the speaker, often leaning back, arms crossed. So they really do appear to be somewhere else entirely. And given that they're not always really participants in the conversation in terms of contributing their thoughts in the moment, there can be perceived as at times, not really a team player. Once they have that time to process and think through and line up their thoughts, when they come back and they share, it's really often profound and so well thought out, but it comes later. And so that takes people off guard and they think, why didn't you say that in the meeting? We really needed that then. We could have used that, but they just weren't ready. They have to process and filter.
Some people have better ideas the next day.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I learned another one years ago. Actually, I remember when I worked with super creative people in the opera business, and I was just beginning. And I always thought, well, why can't I have a million ideas at a time? I was working with someone. I'm a better problem solver who can process it. I have to think about it overnight. Yeah. And I remember sitting in rehearsal with a very famous director and a very famous conductor, and I was just an assistant, little measly assistant over. And the director suggested an idea to the conductor, and the conductor said, "Well, let me think about it overnight. You know me, I'm better if I can think about it overnight." And I thought, thank God I'm not the only one. If this super famous conductor needs to think about something new overnight before he knows whether he wants to do it, it's got to be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that once we know that about our colleagues, if we know we have someone that we work with that's highly reflective in their listening, we can give them a heads up about what we want their thoughts on at times. And then we know once it comes, it's going to be really well thought out versus just putting them on the spot and demanding an answer in the moment. Sometimes when we're working with reflective listeners, we really just have to exercise some patience and trust that it's coming.
So we've talked about the connective and the reflective.
Yes.
Where do the analytical and conceptual listeners fit in?
Yeah. So our dominant analytical listeners are often misunderstood as well, but for different reasons. So these are folks who are processing through the lens of data, information, accuracy, what is right, what has been proven or can be proven to get to the right outcome and create a course of action that's chosen to produce that right outcome. So they're really unbiased in their listening and in their decision making. They're looking at the information for merit and efficacy. And so at times, when I say they're misinterpreted or judged by their colleagues, they want to make sure that it's right. And they're going to go deep into the weeds to make sure that it's right. And so they might ask questions of others who are sharing information that almost seem to be challenging the credibility of that person, of that speaker, when really they're not concerned about the person. They're concerned about the credibility of the information. So they're often judged as the naysayer or the skeptic or the hole poker, when really sometimes that's exactly what the team needs to slow them down and make sure that resources are allocated appropriately, that things have been thought through from a more diagnostic lens. So our analytical listeners, like I said, they're often misperceived as an outlier or not a team player at times, when really their gift to the team is to have a finger on the pulse
Mm-hmm.
of what is. And then our conceptual listeners are quite different in that they're listening for big picture, abstract ideas. They hear patterns. They're listening for potentiality, possibilities. It's really more future oriented listening. And so they get excited about what information inspires,
Mm-hmm.
what can be done with what is being shared. And when I talk about them listening in patterns, they can make connections between hearing very disparate ideas that make complete sense to them. It's a very non-linear way of processing information and solution-oriented thinking. So sometimes our highly conceptual listeners are perceived as coming out of left field
Mm-hmm.
with their ideas, or impulsively sharing at times, or kind of rambling when they share, because they do tend to process out loud and sometimes overshare.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, in their body language, you can really often tell a highly conceptual listener by the amount of movement, the hand gestures, lots of hand gestures, urgency almost in body language, shifting, fidgeting. Sometimes our highly conceptual listeners can't even sit in their chair when they're speaking. They get up, they walk around, they go to the whiteboard. Now, contrast that with our highly analytical listener, who tends to have that look that you were talking about before, almost a skeptical look or a furrowed brow, or they're evaluating the information, but sometimes it can show up in the body as looking like they're in disagreement, or give the impression that they don't believe, when really it's more the expression is evaluation from that non-biased lens. Yeah.
That's so important. Tell me quickly, why is this different from, say, a personality system like DISC or Myers-Briggs? It's not the same. And when I first heard about it, I said, oh, yeah, same old, same old. But this is actually different.
Yeah. The instruments measure for really different things. And that said, all assessments, I think, have value, especially when we layer them. I think for a leader or anyone who's looking to make any kind of shift in their career trajectory, like you said, someone who really wants to be heard, feels like they're not at that point, the more that they can learn about themselves, the better. And so when we layer different types of assessments, personality, behaviors, motivations, with the cognitive assessment like ECHO or emergenetics, when we layer them together, we get a bigger, fuller picture of who we are, what drives us, and more information on how we might shift or adapt to meet different circumstances and different people and different situations. Right. So something like, a DISC or Myers-Briggs measures something that is more hardwired in us, who we are. So if we shift our job, our role, our company, those are things that are not going to change. For example, if we are truly an extrovert or truly an introvert, by changing how many people that we're with or the types of networking situations we put ourselves in, our personality is not going to change. Whereas with the cognitive assessment, the ECHO model, because our listening behaviors are habit-based, we can shift them when we become aware of them. And so in any given situation, if we pause to get present, really tune in to what habits are we relying on in that moment, is it the most appropriate and effective for the intended outcome? Do we need to shift that to add more value in a situation? Do we need to shift how we're showing up in order to be heard by the other people in the room, around the table? We can do that with the results of this, habit-based tool.
Awareness is everything. That's what I keep saying. Awareness is, the more you are aware, rule number one is know your audience, make it about them, Use strategic empathy. This fits very well with my technique of strategic empathy. It was where if you listen and put yourself into the shoes of your listeners and then know how they listen and how they take in information, then you can give them information in a way that they can hear it.
You just nailed it. I mean, you absolutely nailed what we are all about, Elizabeth, with ECHO, with effective communication for healthy organizations. It's first, number one, be aware of yourself. Mm-hmm. Gain great awareness around yourself, your own habits, your own distractions. Second, be very attentive to the cues that your audience is giving you in terms of not just their body language. That's just one piece of the puzzle, and it helps us to kind of assess in some way, but really the language choices, the questions that they ask. Different listeners will use very different language choices when they're asking us questions, and that can help us really identify what it is that's important to them. When they give us those cues and we tune into them, we can shift how we deliver information so that they can take it in easier. It's easier for them. I'm not saying dumb it down.
Yeah.
I'm saying shift the way that we deliver it so that they can really, truly absorb it.
I keep saying it's you're still you and it's still your ideas. You're just saying it in a way that they can hear it better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's something I love to ask people, because we have all these perceptions about what a good listener is or what a bad listener is, or if we say, sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm a great listener," and I say, "Well, what is it that has you say that?" "Well, I really pay attention. I don't multitask. I make a lot of eye contact." And I say, "That's super interesting, and it may be true." But really, the true test of whether or not someone is a good listener is not that they've given themselves, that title. But if you think about when you're in communication with someone, what is it that has you feel like they're a great listener?
Okay.
You walk away feeling heard. You walk away feeling understood, respected, valued. So we can't give ourselves the title of good listener. That has to be given to us from our conversational partners.
I love it. And I think there's so much more. I'm going to have to bring you back. There's certainly more that we're going to talk in. You and I are going to do a joint program one of these days because we have so much to talk about. But that's a really good way to end, is that you have to be perceived as a great listener. You can't just give yourself the title. Yes.
100%.
Allison O'Brien, thank you so much for sharing the tiniest fraction of all that you do. You do so very much. I really appreciate having you on the show. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, follow us on YouTube, tell your friends, and especially leave us a good review on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that matters. Leave us a good review, and I hope you'll come back for the next conversation. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.